The fire crackled in the stone hearth, casting dancing shadows across the weathered face of a man who had seen 62 winters come and go. Ethan Thornfield sat motionless in his leather chair, gnarled hands wrapped around a tin cup of coffee that had long since gone cold. The Montana night pressed against the windows of his ranch house, wind howling like a ghost, searching for passage into the warmth within. His eyes, still sharp despite the years, fixed on the flames. Behind him, hanging on the wall of rough-hewn pine, was a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image, captured by a traveling photographer in the summer of 1888, showed a family. A weathered rancher standing beside a beautiful native woman, 5 children arranged around them like flowers in a careful garden, and in the corner of the frame, barely visible, the massive head of a horse whose eyes seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Ethan's lips moved, forming words that had waited 20 years to be spoken aloud. People say destiny is just coincidence dressed up in Sunday clothes, but I know different. I know destiny has hooves and knows the path through a blizzard when a man's eyes see nothing but white death. His fingers traced the rim of the cup, remembering. Destiny doesn't knock polite on your door. It tears through your life like a Montana winter storm, strips away everything you thought you knew, and leaves you standing in the wreckage, wondering if you're dead or finally, for the first time, truly alive. He set the cup down with careful precision, the sound sharp in the quiet room. This is how it happened. This is how thunder brought me home. The fire popped, sending a spray of embers against the blackened stone, and Ethan Thornfield closed his eyes, letting the memories rise like smoke. February 1887, Montana Territory. The sky had been the color of old iron all day, pressing down on the land like a lid on a pot ready to boil over. Ethan Thornfield, 42 years old and feeling every year of it in his bones, had spent the afternoon in the town of Stillwater, 15 miles from his ranch, trading beaver pelts for supplies he'd need to survive until spring decided to show its face. The general store had been warm, smelling of coffee beans and tobacco, lamp oil, and new fabric. Mrs. Martha Hutchins, the proprietor's wife, had counted out his change with the efficiency of a woman who'd done this same task 10,000 times before. "Storms comin', Mr. Thornfield," she'd said, her voice carrying that particular tone people use when stating the obvious feels like a civic duty. "You best hurry home before it catches you." He'd nodded, touched the brim of his hat, and walked out into air so cold it felt like breathing broken glass. The wagon waited where he'd left it, a simple affair of oak and iron that his father James had built back in 1865, when Montana was still wild enough that a man needed to know how to make things that would last. Thunder, his Shire stallion, stood patient in the traces, breath rising in great clouds that the wind snatched away before they could fully form. 8 years old, Thunder was, 18 hands high at the shoulder, gray as winter dawn, with feathered hooves the size of dinner plates, and a temperament so steady that Ethan had once joked the horse could pull a wagon through hellfire without breaking stride. "Time to go home, old friend," Ethan said, climbing onto the wooden bench seat. The leather reins were stiff with cold, shaped by years of use into the exact curve of his palms. Thunder's ears flicked back, acknowledging the voice, and they rolled out of Stillwater just as the first snowflakes began to fall. For the first 5 miles, it was just weather. Unpleasant, cold enough to make a man pull his collar up and wish he'd worn an extra pair of wool socks, but nothing a Montana rancher couldn't handle with his eyes closed. The road stretched ahead, 2 wheel ruts in frozen mud, bordered by prairie grass bent low under the weight of gathering snow. Then the wind changed. It came from the north, screaming down from Canada, with nothing to slow it but 300 miles of open plain, and it brought with it the full fury of a Montana blizzard. Within minutes, the world disappeared. The road vanished beneath a blanket of white. The horizon collapsed into a wall of swirling snow that moved like something alive, something hungry. Temperature dropped so fast, Ethan could feel it through his buffalo hide coat. 25 below zero, maybe 30. Cold enough to freeze spit before it hit the ground. Cold enough to kill a man in an hour if he couldn't find shelter. Thunder pushed forward, head down against the wind, hooves finding purchase where Ethan's eyes could see nothing but white chaos. The wagon groaned and shook, wheels crackling through crusted snow that had already drifted knee-deep in the ruts. "Steady, boy," Ethan called, but the wind took his words and scattered them like seeds. His mind drifted, the way a man's mind does when the cold gets into his bones and starts making him drowsy. He thought about his wife Margaret, dead 4 years now, buried in the small cemetery plot on the east side of his ranch next to his father. Scarlet fever had taken her in the winter of 1883, and she'd died the way she'd lived, quietly and without complaint, holding his hand until the very end. Her last words still echoed in his memory, spoken in a whisper so faint he'd had to lean close to hear. "Don't live like a dead man, Ethan. Promise me. When I'm gone, don't bury yourself beside me." He'd promised, and he'd lied. For 4 years, he'd lived alone in the ranch house his father had built in 1862. Alone except for Thunder and Wolf, his 4-year-old shepherd dog. He'd worked the land, tended his small herd of cattle, fixed what broke, and spoke to no one unless business required it. The loneliness had settled into him like cold into stone, so deep and so complete that he'd stopped noticing it was there. Thunder stopped. The abruptness of it nearly threw Ethan against the front board of the wagon. His hands, numb with cold, fumbled with the reins as his mind struggled to catch up with what had just happened. "Easy," he said, more to himself than the horse. "What's wrong?" Thunder's ears were forward, straining toward something in the wall of white ahead. His nostrils flared wide, testing the air. His whole body had gone tense, muscles bunched under his thick winter coat. In 6 years together, Ethan had never seen the stallion refuse a command. Never seen him balk or shy or show anything but absolute steadiness in any situation. A man learned to trust a horse like that. Learned to trust him more than his own instincts sometimes, because a horse's senses reached farther and deeper than human reason could follow. "What do you see, boy?" Ethan asked quietly. Thunder shook his massive head, harness jingling. Then, with deliberate force, he turned left, pulling the wagon off the road and into deep prairie snow. Ethan's first instinct was to pull back on the reins, to force the horse back onto the path home. His ranch was east. The fire he'd banked before leaving would be down to coals now, but there'd be enough heat left to kindle it back to life. There was food in his larder, a full woodpile, and walls thick enough to keep out the worst of the storm. Safety was east. Thunder was pulling west, into open country where there was nothing but frozen prairie for miles. The memories rose unbidden. His father's voice, rough as sandpaper, speaking words that had been spoken on a summer afternoon when Ethan was just 15. "Son, when a good horse refuses to go where you point him, it's because he sees something you don't. You can fight him, and maybe you'll win, but maybe what he sees is the thing that would have killed you. Trust your horse before you trust yourself." James Thornfield had died in 1883, 2 months after Margaret. Heart gave out while he was mending fence on the North 40. Ethan had found him sitting against a post, tools still in his hands, eyes closed like he'd just decided to take a rest. At 68 years old, His father had looked peaceful. Ready. Ethan loosened the reins. "All right," he said into the wind. "Show me." Thunder lunged forward, throwing his weight into the traces with renewed purpose. The wagon lurched and swayed, wheels grinding through snow that was now nearly 3 feet deep. Twice they bogged down, and twice Ethan had to climb down into the freezing hell of the storm, take up the wooden lever he kept strapped to the wagon bed, and use it to pry the wheels free while Thunder waited with the patience of stone. His hands were going numb. His face felt like raw meat. Ice had formed in his beard, and every breath was a knife of cold straight into his lungs. 20 minutes passed, maybe 30. Time lost meaning in the white chaos. Then Wolf started barking. The dog had been lying quiet in the wagon bed, conserved heat the way animals do when survival depends on it. But now he was on his feet, barking with a tone Ethan had never heard before. Not aggressive, not afraid. Something else. Something urgent. Thunder stopped again. Through the swirling snow, Ethan saw movement. At first, his cold, addled brain couldn't make sense of it. Just a dark shape, bent and struggling, appearing and disappearing in the veils of white. Then the shape separated into distinct forms, and Ethan's heart clenched in his chest like a fist. A woman, native from the look of her buckskin dress and the long black hair that whipped around her face. She was staggering through knee-deep snow, clutching something wrapped in a thin wool blanket against her chest. Behind her, strung out in a ragged line, were 4 small girls. The oldest couldn't have been more than 9. She walked with grim determination, holding the hand of a younger sister with one hand while using the other to push against the wind. Behind them came 2 more children, the smallest barely able to keep her feet, clinging to her sister's skirt like it was the only solid thing left in the world. They were dying. Ethan could see it in the way they moved, in the deathly pale color of their lips, in the slow-motion quality of their struggle. Another 20 minutes in this storm, maybe less, and the cold would take them down. The snow would cover them. By morning, they'd be nothing but shapes under white blankets, frozen solid as the ground. Ethan jumped down from the wagon, his boots sinking deep. Wolf leaped after him, but instead of barking now, the dog moved forward, slowly, deliberately, tail low and head down, in a posture of absolute non-threat. The woman saw them. Her head snapped up, and even through the snow, Ethan could see the fear that flashed across her face. She stumbled backward, nearly falling, clutching the bundle tighter to her chest. "Stay away!" Her voice was raw, broken by cold and exhaustion, but fierce. "Stay back!" The oldest girl moved instantly, stepping in front of her mother, placing her small body between the woman and these strangers who had materialized out of the storm like spirits. Her face was set in lines too hard for a child, eyes dark and watchful, and ready to fight even though she was shaking so badly her teeth chattered. Wolf stopped 3 feet from them. He lowered himself to the ground, belly in the snow, and made a sound that was somewhere between a whine and a croon. His tail swept back and forth, slow and gentle. The oldest girl stared at the dog. Her fierce expression cracked just a little. She reached out one trembling hand, and Wolf inched forward, pressing his head into her palm. The girl's face crumpled. A sob broke from her throat, and she sank to her knees in the snow, both arms going around the dog's neck. Ethan raised his hands, palms out, moving as slowly as if you were approaching a wild thing that might bolt at any sudden motion. "Ma'am," he said, pitching his voice to carry through the wind, but keeping it low, calm. "My name is Ethan Thornfield. I have a cabin 2 miles east of here. You and your children will freeze to death if you stay out here." The woman didn't answer. She was staring at him, at Thunder, at Wolf, and Ethan could see the calculation happening behind her eyes. Desperation warring with fear. Need fighting against a terror so deep it had worn grooves into her soul. "Mama," the oldest girl said, her voice muffled against Wolf's fur. "He's not like Papa. His eyes are different." Something in those words hit Ethan like a physical blow. He'd heard enough in his life to recognize what lay beneath them. The kind of fear that came from living with violence. The kind of wariness that only made sense if home had become a place of danger instead of safety. The woman looked at Thunder. The big stallion stood absolutely still, head low, breathing clouds of steam that the wind tore apart. She looked at Wolf, pressed against her daughter like a guardian. She looked at Ethan's face, and whatever she saw there made something inside her give way. She nodded. Once. Barely. "If you hurt my children," she said, and her voice was flat, empty of everything except the promise of consequence, "my father's spirit will hunt you. Do you understand?" "Yes, ma'am," Ethan said. "I understand." He moved quickly then, because every second they stood there was another second the cold could kill them. The smallest child first, scooped up in his arms so light he could feel every bone, wrapped in the thick buffalo hide he kept folded on the wagon bench. Then the next youngest, and the next, each one placed carefully in the wagon bed, tucked into every blanket and hide he had. When he reached for the oldest girl, she pulled back. "I can climb myself," she said. "Yes, ma'am," Ethan replied, and stepped back to let her do it. The woman was last. She tried to pull herself up, but her legs wouldn't hold her. Ethan caught her before she fell, felt her stiffen at his touch, and lifted her as gently as he knew how onto the wagon seat. "Hold tight," he said, climbing up beside her but keeping distance between them. "Thunder, home, fast as you can." The stallion needed no urging. He leaned into the traces and pulled, and the wagon lurched forward into the screaming white. The next 40 minutes existed outside of time. There was only the wind, the cold, the endless white. Thunder pulled with every ounce of strength in his massive body, head down, hooves pounding, breath coming in labored gasps. The wagon wheels broke through drifts, stuck, broke free again. Snow piled on the bench, on Ethan's shoulders, on the huddled forms in the wagon bed. Once, Thunder stumbled. His hoof caught on something hidden beneath the snow, a root or a stone, and he went to his knees with a sound like breaking wood. The wagon tilted sickeningly, and Ethan's heart stopped dead in his chest. "Easy," he called, dropping the reins and jumping down. The snow was up to his thighs. "Easy, boy. I've got you." He put his shoulder under Thunder's chest, planted his feet, and pushed. 300 pounds of muscle and bone and determination focused into one moment. Thunder surged up, found his footing, and shook himself like a dog. Ethan climbed back onto the bench, ignoring the shooting pain in his shoulder where he'd wrenched it. His hands were past cold now, past pain, into that dangerous territory where they'd stopped feeling like part of his body. "Not much farther," he said, though he wasn't sure if he was talking to Thunder or to himself, or to the woman beside him, who sat rigid and silent, clutching the bundle that he now realized must be a baby. Then, like a miracle, a dark shape emerged from the white. The cabin, his cabin, one story, built from pine logs his father had cut and peeled and fitted together with the precision of a man who knew winter in Montana didn't forgive sloppy work. Smoke still rose from the stone chimney, a thin gray line that meant the fire hadn't died completely. Ethan pulled Thunder to a stop in front of the door, jumped down, and moved fast. The children first, carried one by one into the cabin's warmth. Then the woman, who'd finally reached the end of her strength and sagged against him without protest. Inside, the fire was down to sullen coals glowing in the stone hearth. Ethan fed it kindling, then larger pieces of split pine, coaxing it back to life while the family huddled near, too cold to do anything but shake. The cabin was simple. One large room with a sleeping area curtained off at one end, a table and chairs hand-built from oak, a cast-iron stove that bore the maker's mark Acme Stove Company, 1878, and along the walls, shelves holding the necessities of a solitary life. Dried beans in jars, salted meat hanging from hooks, tools cleaned and oiled and waiting for spring. When the fire was roaring, Ethan hung a tin kettle on the iron hook over the flames and filled it with water from the bucket by the door. He pulled out his stores of oatmeal, began heating it in a pot on the stove, added salt and a precious spoonful of honey. The woman sat in the corner farthest from him, the baby still clutched to her chest, watching his every move with eyes that had learned not to trust. The four girls pressed close to her, and Wolf lay down in front of them, placing himself between them and everything else in the world. Ethan filled wooden bowls with oatmeal, placed them within reach, then stepped back, didn't speak, didn't look at them directly, just turned back to the fire and focused on heating more water. After a long moment, the oldest girl reached out and took a bowl. She tested a spoonful, found it wasn't too hot, and began to eat with the careful deliberateness of someone who'd known real hunger. "Thank you, sir," she said quietly. Ethan nodded without turning around. One by one, the others began to eat. The woman was last, and even then, she only took food after making sure each of her children had eaten their fill. Outside, the storm howled, like all the demons of hell were trying to claw their way through the walls. Inside, the fire crackled, and the warmth slowly, so slowly, began to seep back into frozen bodies. Ethan stood by the window, looking out at nothing but white, and wondered what thunder had known that led him to pull the wagon off the road and into the storm. Wondered what had made Wolf, who'd never shown affection to strangers, press himself against that little girl, like he'd been waiting his whole life for her. Behind him, the woman whispered something in a language he didn't understand. The girls murmured in response. Then silence, except for the storm and the fire, and the sound of small spoons scraping against wooden bowls. Ethan closed his eyes and sent up a wordless prayer to whatever power watched over fools and strangers lost in blizzards. The night was far from over, but they were alive. For now, that was enough. Dawn came late and gray, filtering through windows thick with frost, until the cabin interior glowed with pale winter light. Ethan woke in the chair where he'd sat watch all night, neck stiff, back aching, the Winchester rifle still resting across his knees. The fire had burned down to coals again. He stood carefully, joints protesting, and fed it fresh wood from the stack beside the hearth. The sound of splitting kindling seemed loud in the silence, but none of the sleeping forms stirred. The woman and her children lay in his bed, the only real bed in the cabin, buried under every quilt and blanket he owned. He could see the rise and fall of breathing, could hear the soft sounds of children deep in exhausted sleep. The baby, wrapped in wool and nestled between two of the girls, made small noises but didn't wake. Ethan pulled on his coat, wound a scarf around his face, and stepped outside into a world transformed. The storm had passed in the night, leaving behind 3 feet of fresh snow that lay smooth and unmarked across the prairie like a white sea frozen in mid-wave. The sky was the hard, clear blue that only came after big storms, and the sun glittered on the snow with a brightness that hurt to look at. Thunder stood in his small stable, the structure his father had built to shelter the ranch's working animals. The stallion's breath steamed in the cold air. When he saw Ethan, he nickered softly, a sound of greeting and mild complaint. "I know, old friend," Ethan said, unlatching the stall door. "You did good last night. Better than good." He checked the horse carefully, running his hands down each leg, feeling for heat or swelling that might indicate injury from that stumble in the storm. Thunder stood patient under the examination, occasionally turning his head to nuzzle at Ethan's shoulder. Nothing. The big stallion was sound. Ethan measured out 15 pounds of oats from the barrel in the corner, added 10 pounds of dried prairie grass from the loft above, and watched while Thunder ate with the methodical efficiency of a horse who'd earned every bite. The 2 Jersey cows in the next stalls over needed milking. The 3 Plymouth Rock hens in their protected coop needed feeding and their eggs collecting. There was wood to split, paths to shovel, a dozen small tasks that made up the morning routine of a working ranch. Ethan lost himself in the work, the familiar rhythm of it, the way it quieted his mind and focused his thoughts on simple, solvable problems. His shoulder still ached where he'd wrenched it lifting Thunder, but pain was just information. It would heal. By the time he came back inside, carrying a pail of fresh milk and 4 eggs carefully wrapped in a cloth, the sun was fully up and the cabin had begun to warm. The oldest girl was awake. She sat on the edge of the bed, carefully not looking at him, her body positioned between Ethan and her sleeping family. "Morning," Ethan said quietly, setting the milk pail on the table. "Morning, sir." Her voice was steady, but he could see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands were clenched in her lap. "You can call me Ethan, or Mr. Thornfield if you prefer." She nodded, but didn't speak. Ethan moved to the stove, began preparing breakfast. Pancakes, because he had flour and the eggs and milk were fresh. He worked in silence, mixing batter in a ceramic bowl, heating the cast-iron skillet until a drop of water danced across its surface. "What's your name?" he asked, without turning around. A long pause, then, "Sarah." "That's a good name." "My mama named me for a woman in the Bible who waited a long time for something good to happen." Ethan flipped the first pancake. "Did something good happen to her? The Bible woman?" "Yes, sir. Eventually." He nodded, sliding the pancake onto a tin plate. "I hope the same for you, Sarah." The other children woke one by one as the smell of cooking food filled the cabin. The second oldest, maybe 7, with braids that had come loose in the night. The third, around 5, who watched Ethan with enormous dark eyes and stayed pressed close to her mother. The youngest, barely more than a toddler, who seemed too exhausted still to do much more than cling to the nearest sister. The woman woke last. Ethan saw the exact moment consciousness returned, saw her eyes snap open and her body go rigid as she remembered where she was. She sat up slowly, the baby stirring against her chest, and her gaze swept the cabin before landing on him. "Good morning, ma'am," Ethan said, keeping his voice level and his movements slow as he placed a plate of pancakes on the table. "There's food when you're ready. No rush." She didn't respond, just watched him with those dark, wary eyes while he set out tin cups and poured milk, placed the small crock of honey in the center of the table, stepped back to give them space. Sarah stood first, helping her sisters to the table. They climbed onto the chairs his father had made from oak, feet dangling, and stared at the food like they weren't quite sure it was real. "Go ahead," Ethan said. "Eat your fill." The second oldest, the one with loose braids, reached for a pancake. Ethan saw her glance at her mother first, saw the woman give a tiny nod before the girl took a bite. Her eyes went wide. "Lizzie," the woman said softly, and the girl nodded, swallowing. "Thank you, sir." One by one, the others began to eat. Sarah helped the youngest, the little one who could barely hold a fork, cutting her pancake into small pieces and making sure she ate slowly. The woman was last again. She held the baby, who Ethan could now see was a boy, maybe 6 months old, with his mother's dark eyes and a crown of fine black hair. She ate with one hand, mechanically, her attention divided between the food and watching Ethan's every movement. He understood. Trust wasn't something you could ask for. It was something you had to earn, minute by minute, by proving yourself safe. When they'd finished, when the plates were empty and the milk drunk, Ethan cleared the table without comment. He heated water for washing, left clean cloths and a bar of soap within reach, and went back outside to give them privacy. The day passed in careful silence. Ethan worked on small repairs, sharpening tools, checking his stores, anything that needed doing but kept him visible through the windows so they could see where he was. The woman and her children stayed inside, and he didn't intrude. It was late afternoon when he came in to stoke the fire and found the woman standing in the center of the room, holding something in her hands that made her whole body shake. A blanket. Wool, dyed a deep navy blue, with an intricate pattern worked in yellow and red thread along the edges. Lightning bolts arranged in a zigzag, each one perfect, each one identical. The kind of work that took months to complete, that required skill passed down through generations. The woman's face was white as the snow outside. Her lips moved, forming words that had no sound, and her hands gripped the blanket so tight her knuckles showed bone white. "Where?" she whispered, and her voice broke. "Where did you get this?" Ethan felt the floor drop out from under him. He knew that blanket, had known it for 10 years, had carried it like a weight around his neck, a reminder of a debt he could never repay and a guilt he couldn't escape. "Ma'am?" he said slowly. "I can explain." She turned to face him, and the look in her eyes was raw agony. "This is my father's blanket. My mother and I made this for him when I was 12 years old. The lightning path pattern, our family's mark. He wore it the day he left to go hunting elk in the winter of 1877. Her voice rose, cracking with 10 years of unanswered questions. "He never came home. They searched for a week and found nothing. No body, no trace. My mother died 4 years later, still not knowing what happened to him." She took a step toward Ethan, holding the blanket out like an accusation. "So I will ask you one more time, and I want the truth. Where did you get my father's blanket?" Sarah had stood up, placing herself between her mother and Ethan again, but her face was confused now, uncertain. The other girls huddled together by the bed, eyes wide. Ethan looked at the blanket, looked at the woman whose father had saved his life at the cost of his own, looked at the children who were the grandchildren of the man who'd died so a stranger could live. "Your father's name was William Morningstar," he said quietly. The woman gasped, staggered, caught herself against the table. "How do you know that name?" "Because I'm the man he saved, and I'm the reason he's dead." The silence that followed was absolute. Even the fire seemed to quiet, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Ethan moved slowly to the chair by the hearth and sat down, not because he wanted to, but because his legs suddenly didn't want to hold him anymore. "It was January of 1877, he began, and his voice sounded strange to his own ears, distant and hollow. 10 years ago this month, I was 32 years old, hauling 200 pounds of beaver pelts to Stillwater, worth about $400. Big money back then, enough to buy seed for spring planting and pay off some debts. He stared into the fire, watching the flames dance. I was coming through Beartooth Pass when the ice got me. The road was pure ice under a dusting of snow. Didn't see it until the wheels started sliding. The wagon went over, rolled down about 20 feet before a tree stopped it. The axle broke clean through, and the wagon bed came down on top of me, pinned my left leg. His hand unconsciously moved to his left boot, where beneath the leather, 2 toes were missing, claimed by frostbite that night. It was 30 below, maybe colder. I couldn't move, couldn't free myself. I shouted until my voice gave out, but there was nobody coming. That pass sees maybe 2 people a month in winter. The woman had sunk into a chair, the blanket still clutched in her hands. Sarah stood beside her, one hand on her mother's shoulder, listening with an intensity that seemed too old for her young face. I was starting to drift, Ethan continued. That's what happens when you freeze. You get sleepy. Start to feel warm even though you're dying. I'd pretty much accepted it, made my peace. Then I heard a voice. He closed his eyes, remembering. Your father came walking out of the woods like an angel. Big man, strong, with gray in his hair and hands that knew how to work. He climbed down to where I was trapped, looked at the situation, and didn't waste time on words. He found a branch, 6 feet long and thick as my arm, wedged it under that axle, and pried it up with everything he had. Ethan's throat tightened. Pulled me out. I couldn't walk, couldn't feel my feet anymore. He wrapped me in this blanket, the one you're holding, and he said something I'll never forget. He said, "My daughter Ayanna made this with her mother. It will keep you warm." The woman, Ayanna, made a sound like something breaking. He told me to stay put, that he was going to find a branch strong enough to make a stretcher, drag me out to where someone might find me. I tried to tell him to just go, get help, come back, but he wouldn't leave me there alone. Ethan's voice dropped to barely a whisper. He walked about 30 feet. I could see him testing branches, looking for one that would work. Then the ground gave way. He opened his eyes, looked directly at Ayanna. The snow had drifted over a drop-off, maybe 200 feet down. Sheer rock. Your father went through, like the earth just opened up and swallowed him. I heard him shout, heard the sound of him hitting the rocks below, and then nothing. Tears were running down Ayanna's face now, silent and steady. I crawled to the edge, looked down into that darkness, called his name until I couldn't speak anymore. But there was no answer, no way down, no way to reach him. I don't remember much after that. Somehow I crawled back to the wagon, wrapped in his blanket. Somehow I managed to splint my own leg well enough to stand. Took me 2 days to make it back to Stillwater, 15 miles through snow. Lost 2 toes on my left foot to frostbite. Nearly lost the whole leg. He looked down at his hands. The marshal organized a search party. 7 men spent a week combing that pass. Never found a trace. The snow was too deep, the drop-off too sheer. William Morningstar had vanished like he'd never been. Ethan stood, walked to where Ayanna sat, and knelt down so he could look her in the eye. I kept the blanket. I told myself I was going to find your family, return it, tell them what happened. Tell them that William Morningstar died a hero's death, saving a stranger. But I was afraid. Afraid to face the people he'd left behind. Afraid to admit that I lived and he didn't. So I kept it, and I stayed silent. And I've carried that guilt for 10 years like iron chains." Ayana's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely audible. "My mother died, not knowing. She died, thinking he'd abandoned us, that he'd walked away and started a new life somewhere else." "I'm sorry," Ethan said, and the words were ash in his mouth. "I know it's not enough. I know nothing I can say will ever be enough. But I am so sorry." She stared at him for a long moment, her face a battlefield of emotions. Grief, anger, relief at finally knowing the truth, fury at the years of silence. Then she stood abruptly, the blanket falling from her hands, and walked to the door. She stepped outside into the freezing afternoon without her coat, without anything but the thin buckskin dress she'd been wearing when thunder found them. Sarah moved to follow, but Ethan held up a hand. "Let her go. She needs space." Through the window, he watched Ayana walk out into the snow. She made it maybe 20 feet before she sank to her knees, head thrown back, and screamed. A raw, primal sound of grief that had been bottled up for a decade, finally given voice. She screamed until she had no breath left, then collapsed forward, hands buried in the snow, shoulders shaking with sobs. Ethan started for the door, but Sarah caught his arm. "Wait," she said softly. They stood together, watching, as Ayana wept for the father she'd lost, and the mother who'd died without answers, and the 10 years of not knowing that had carved a hole in the center of her life. After a long time, she stood, walked back to the cabin. Her face was red from cold and crying, her hands were white, but her eyes were clearer somehow, like something that had been festering had finally been lanced. She stopped in the doorway, looking at Ethan. "You should have come to us. You should have told us." "I know. My mother deserved to know the truth." "Yes, ma'am, she did." Ayana stepped inside, closed the door, and picked up the blanket from where it had fallen. She held it to her face, breathing in the scent of old wool and wood smoke and the faint, lingering trace of the father she'd loved. "He saved you," she said finally. "He saw a man dying, and he chose to help, even knowing it was dangerous. That was who he was. That was how he lived." She lowered the blanket, looked at Ethan with eyes that held something other than anger now. Not forgiveness, not yet, but perhaps the beginning of understanding. "Thank you for telling me, for finally giving me the truth." Ethan nodded, not trusting his voice. The cabin fell into silence again, but it was a different kind of silence now. Not comfortable, not easy, but no longer filled with secrets and lies. As night fell and Ethan lit the oil lamps, Sarah approached him quietly. "Sir? Mr. Thornfield?" "Yes, Sarah." "You're a good man. Mama doesn't trust easy, but I can see it. You've got kind eyes. Not like—" She stopped, bit her lip. "Not like your father?" Ethan finished gently. She nodded, tears suddenly bright in her eyes. "He wasn't always bad. He used to be good. But then he started drinking, and when he drank, he got mean. And we were so scared all the time." Ethan put a hand on her shoulder, light enough that she could step away if she wanted. She didn't. "You're safe here, Sarah. I promise you that. As long as you need shelter, you have it." From across the room, Ayana was watching. She caught his eye, held his gaze for a moment, then gave the tiniest nod. It wasn't trust, not yet, but it was a beginning. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Inside, the fire burned warm and steady. And in the corner, wrapped in a blanket that carried the memory of a father who'd died saving strangers, 5 children and their mother settled in to face whatever came next. The story was far from over. But for tonight, they were warm. They were fed. And the truth, terrible as it was, had finally been spoken aloud. Sometimes that was enough. 3 days passed like water through cupped hands, each one bringing small changes to the careful distance between Ethan and the family that had taken refuge under his roof. The first morning, Ayanna woke before dawn and began cleaning the cabin with the quiet efficiency of a woman reclaiming some measure of control over her circumstances. Ethan found her sweeping the plank floor with a broom of bound twigs, the baby Thomas strapped to her back in a carrier fashioned from a wool shawl. "You don't need to do that," he said. She didn't look up. "I need to do something. We can't just take and give nothing back." He understood. Pride was sometimes the only thing a person had left when everything else had been stripped away. So he nodded and went about his morning chores, leaving her to her work. By the second day, the girls had begun to venture outside. Sarah helped him feed the chickens, her small hands scattering grain with careful precision, while the Plymouth rocks clucked and pecked around her feet. Lizzie, the 7-year-old with the loosened braids that Ayanna had replaited into tight, neat rows, stood in the stable doorway, watching Thunder with a mixture of awe and longing. "You can pet him if you want," Ethan said, pitching his voice low so as not to startle her. "He's gentle as a lamb, big as he is." Lizzie glanced back toward the cabin, seeking permission that wasn't there to give, then took 3 hesitant steps forward. Thunder lowered his massive head, blowing warm breath that stirred her hair, and the girl's face split into a smile so bright it could have lit the whole barn. Mary, the 5-year-old with enormous dark eyes, preferred Wolf's company to any humans. The dog had appointed himself her guardian, following her everywhere, lying down beside her when she sat, pressing close when she seemed uncertain. Ethan watched them together and saw something he'd never seen in his shepherd before. A gentleness that went beyond training, beyond instinct, into something that looked almost like love. Little Kate, barely 3, still clung to her mother's skirts and watched Ethan with a wariness that broke his heart. He didn't push, just made sure to move slowly when she was near, to keep his voice quiet, to never reach toward her without warning. On the 3rd evening, as Ethan was preparing supper, a simple stew of salted venison and root vegetables, Ayanna finally spoke more than a handful of necessary words. "I need to tell you why we were out in that storm." Ethan paused, the wooden spoon motionless in his hand. "You don't owe me explanations." "Yes," she said quietly, "I do." The girls were playing near the fire, a quiet game with wooden blocks Ethan's father had carved decades ago. Ayanna settled the baby in a nest of blankets, made sure he was content, then came to stand near the table where Ethan worked. "His name is Jacob Blackwood," she began, and even saying the name seemed to cost her something. "My husband." The word landed like a stone in still water, sending ripples through everything that had gone unspoken. "He wasn't always cruel," Ayanna continued, her voice taking on the flat quality of someone reciting facts that had worn grooves into her memory. "When I met him in the summer of 1881, he was a cavalry sergeant, just mustered out of service. He'd fought in the Indian Wars from 1876 to 1880, Battle of Little Bighorn, Rosebud Creek, a dozen other engagements that left marks on his soul he couldn't talk about." She wrapped her arms around herself, though the cabin was warm. "He had nightmares. Every night he'd wake up screaming, seeing things that weren't there. His friend Henry had died at Little Bighorn, blown apart by cannon fire while Jacob watched. After that, something in Jacob broke. The army called it soldier's heart, said it happened to men who'd seen too much death. Ethan nodded slowly. He'd known men like that. The war between the states had ended before he was old enough to fight, but he'd seen the veterans who came back from it, hollow-eyed and haunted, carrying wounds that didn't show on the body. He was handsome, Ayanna said, and there was something like wonder in her voice, as if she was remembering a different man entirely. Polite. He courted me properly, asked my mother's permission, even though my father was gone. He promised he'd take care of me, give me a good life. She laughed, a sound without humor. For a while, he kept that promise. When Sarah was small, Jacob would hold her for hours, singing songs his own father had taught him. He taught her letters, read to her from the Bible. He was patient and kind, and I thought maybe, despite everything he'd been through, we could be happy. What changed? Ethan asked quietly. He lost his job at Fort Benton, came to work drunk one too many times, and they dismissed him. We moved to a small sheep ranch 50 miles south of here. The work was hard, the money scarce. And the people there, the white settlers, they made it clear what they thought of a white man who'd married a native woman, called our daughters half-breeds, told Jacob he'd ruined his life. Ayanna's hands clenched into fists. The whiskey got worse, a bottle a night, then 2. When he drank, the nightmares became waking visions. He'd see enemies in shadows, hear gunfire in the wind. And he got angry. So angry. She looked at Ethan then, and her eyes were dry but devastated. The first time he hit me was in 1883. I'd made tapioca pudding and forgot to add enough salt. Such a small thing. He slapped me across the face, then looked at his hand like he didn't know how it got there. He cried, begged forgiveness, promised it would never happen again. But it did, Ethan said, again and again, each time worse than the last. He'd break dishes, throw furniture. The girls learned to hide when they heard his horse coming. Sarah, my brave Sarah, would gather her sisters and take them under the bed or into the root cellar, and they'd stay there silent as stones until the storm passed. Ayanna's voice cracked. He wanted sons, kept saying that's what a man needed, strong boys to work the land and carry his name. Every time I gave birth to another daughter, his disappointment grew. When Thomas finally came last summer, Jacob was happy for maybe 2 weeks. Then he started saying the boy had come too late, that he'd wasted his best years raising useless girls. Ethan felt rage building in his chest, cold and controlled. Did he hurt the children? Not with his fists, not often, but words can break bones that never heal. He told Sarah she was the reason we were poor, told Lizzie she was too stupid to learn anything, made Mary cry by saying she was ugly. Kate was too young to understand the words, but she understood the tone. Ayanna drew a shaking breath. 2 weeks ago, he came home so drunk he could barely stand. I'd forgotten to mend a tear in his work shirt. He grabbed my hand, bent my fingers back until 2 of them broke. Sarah tried to stop him, and he shoved her so hard she hit the wall and couldn't get up for an hour. She held up her right hand, and Ethan could see the 4th finger was crooked, healed wrong. That night I knew. If I stayed, he would kill me, or kill one of the children, or I would kill him in self-defense and hang for it. So I waited until he passed out, gathered what I could carry, and we ran. Into the storm, Ethan said. Into the storm. I thought we could make it to the Crow Reservation, to my mother's people, 30 miles south. But the snow came so fast, so heavy, we got turned around, lost the road. I knew we were dying. I'd accepted it. Then thunder found us. She looked toward the window, though full dark had fallen and there was nothing to see but their own reflection in the glass. Jacob will come looking. He always finds me when I run. This isn't the first time I've tried to leave. The words hung in the air like smoke. How many times? Ethan asked. 3. The first time, I made it as far as Fort Benton. He found me in 2 days, dragged me home, locked me in the house for a week. The second time, I got to my cousin's home on the reservation. Jacob rode there with the sheriff, claimed I'd stolen money from him. The sheriff made me go back. This time, I didn't tell anyone where I was going, just ran. Sarah had stopped playing. She was listening, her young face set in hard lines. The other girls sensed the mood and huddled together, quiet as rabbits. Ethan set down the spoon, moved to the chair by the fire, and sat so he was at eye level with Ayanna when she finally looked at him. I lost my wife 4 years ago, he said. Margaret. She died of scarlet fever in the winter of 1883, 38 years old. We'd been married 15 years and never had children, though not for lack of wanting them. Ayanna's expression softened slightly. The day before she died, she was still trying to be strong for me, still trying to make me smile. Her last words were, "Don't live like a dead man, Ethan. Promise me, when I'm gone, don't bury yourself beside me." He looked at his hands, calloused and scarred from 4 decades of hard work. I promised her. Then I broke that promise. I've spent 4 years alone in this cabin, working the land, talking to no one, feeling nothing. I was alive, but I wasn't living, just going through the motions, waiting for my own turn in the ground. He raised his eyes to meet Ayanna's. I'm telling you this because I want you to understand something. I know what it's like to lose someone you love, and I know what it's like to be afraid it'll happen again. But I also know that your father didn't die so I could waste the life he saved. Ethan leaned forward, his voice steady and sure. You and your children are welcome here as long as you need to be. If your husband comes looking, he'll have to go through me to get to you. And I promise you, on William Morningstar's memory, I will not let him hurt you or these girls or that baby, not while there's breath in my body. Ayanna stared at him, and for the first time since that night in the storm, something other than fear or grief or wariness crossed her face. Something that might have been hope, fragile as spring ice, but there nonetheless. Why? She whispered. Why would you risk yourself for strangers? Because your father saved my life when he had every reason to keep walking. Because those girls deserve to grow up without fear. Because that baby deserves a chance to become a man who doesn't think violence is the answer to disappointment. And because maybe, if I do this right, I can finally pay back the debt I owe to William Morningstar. Before Ayanna could respond, Wolf's head snapped up. The dog stood in one fluid motion, hackles rising, a low growl rumbling from his chest. Then came the sound that turned Ayanna's face white as snow. Hoofbeats, coming fast through the frozen night. A voice, rough and slurred with drink, shouting into the darkness. "Ayanna, I know you're in there, woman. Come out now, or I'll burn this whole damned place to the ground." Jacob Blackwood had found them. The next morning, after Jacob had been taken to jail, Marshal Callahan returned with troubling news. There's a bounty hunter asking questions in town. Name of Silas Crow. Says Jacob paid him $50 to track down his wife and children. I sent him packing, told him the matter was now in the court's hands. But men like that don't give up easy when money's involved. Ethan's jaw tightened. He comes near this property, he'll answer to my Winchester. That's what I figured you'd say, Callahan replied. I'll keep an eye on him. Just wanted you to know he's out there. Ethan stood, moved to the gun rack on the wall, and took down his Winchester. The rifle was a Model 1873, .44 caliber, with 15 rounds in the magazine and 1 in the chamber. He'd cleaned and oiled it just yesterday, the way his father had taught him. A gun was only as reliable as the man who maintained it. Get the children into the back corner, he said quietly, behind the bed. Stay low. Ayanna didn't argue. She gathered the girls with swift efficiency, herding them to the sleeping area while Sarah carried Thomas, who'd started to cry at the shouting outside. Ethan checked the loads in his Colt revolver, a Peacemaker .45 that rode in a holster on his hip. 6 rounds. Enough for most situations, though he prayed it wouldn't come to shooting. The hoofbeats stopped. A moment of silence. Then the cabin door shook under a heavy fist. "Open this door, Thornfield. I know she's in there. Someone in Stillwater saw you taking in a squaw and a pack of brats. That's my wife. Those are my children. You got no right keeping them from me." Ethan moved to the door, kept his voice level and calm. "Mr. Blackwood, your wife and children are safe. It's late, it's cold, and you've been drinking. Why don't you ride back to town, get yourself a room at the boarding house, and we can talk about this in the morning when you're sober." The response was a roar of incoherent rage and another assault on the door that made the hinges creak. Behind him, Ethan heard Ayanna's voice, barely a whisper. "Please, please don't let him in." In the corner, Sarah had both arms around her sisters, and all 4 girls were shaking. Not from cold. From a fear so deep it had carved canyons in their small souls. Ethan looked at them, looked at Ayanna, looked at the door that was all that stood between this fragile sanctuary and the man who'd turned home into a battlefield. And in that moment, Ethan Thornfield made a choice. The kind of choice that changes the shape of a man's life, that draws a line between who he was and who he would become. He threw the bolt, gripped the Winchester tight, and opened the door. The man on the other side of the door was a ruin. Jacob Blackwood stood swaying in the snow, tall and broad-shouldered, but carrying himself like a structure whose foundation had crumbled from within. His clothes were mismatched, a cavalry coat from his army days hanging open over a stained work shirt, boots caked with frozen mud. His face, which might have been handsome once, was bloated and red from years of hard drinking, and his eyes held the unfocused glaze of a man who was 3/4 drunk and working on the rest. But drunk or not, he had a Colt revolver in his right hand, and it was pointed directly at Ethan's chest. "Where is she?" Jacob's words slurred at the edges, running together like wet paint. "Where's my wife?" Ethan stood in the doorway, Winchester held low but ready, blocking the entrance with his body. Behind him, he could hear the sound of Ayanna trying to quiet the baby's cries, the whispered reassurances she gave her daughters in a language Ethan didn't understand. "Your wife and children are safe," Ethan said again, keeping his voice steady. "That's all that matters right now. Put the gun down, Jacob. Let's talk like men." Jacob laughed, a bitter sound that held no humor. "Talk? You want to talk? About how you stole my family? About how some stranger thinks he can keep what's mine?" "They're not property," Ethan said quietly. "They're people, and they're afraid of you." Something flickered across Jacob's face. Pain, maybe, or shame. There and gone so fast, Ethan couldn't be sure he'd seen it at all. Then the anger came roaring back, fueled by whiskey and wounded pride. "You don't know nothing about it," Jacob snarled. "You don't know what it's like, living with the screams in your head, seeing your friends die over and over every time you close your eyes. You don't know what it's like to come home to a wife who looks at you like you're a monster, and children who hide when they hear your voice." "You're right," Ethan said. "I don't know. But I know you're scaring those little girls. I know your wife's hand is still crooked from where you broke her fingers, and I know that whatever hell you've been through doesn't give you the right to make a hell for them." Jacob's gun hand trembled. For a moment, Ethan thought he might lower the weapon, might step back from this edge they were both teetering on. Then Jacob's face twisted, and he raised the Colt higher. "Get out of my way, old man, or I'll put a bullet through you and step over your corpse to get what's mine." In the stable 20 yards away, thunder whinnied, high and sharp. The big stallion slammed against his stall door hard enough that the sound cracked through the frozen air like a gunshot. Wolf, pressed against Ethan's leg, bared his teeth and growled with a sound that came from somewhere primal and dangerous. Jacob's eyes flicked toward the noise, just for a second, just long enough. Ethan swept the Winchester up and squeezed the trigger. The shot went high and wide, exactly as he'd intended, punching through the night sky 6 feet above Jacob's head. The report was deafening in the stillness, echoing off the distant mountains and rolling back like thunder. Jacob jerked, stumbled backward, nearly fell. His own gun discharged, the bullet going wild into the snow. His horse, an Appaloosa gelding tied to the hitching post, reared and screamed. "Next one won't miss," Ethan said, and there was no warmth in his voice now, no gentleness, just the cold certainty of a man who'd made his choice and would see it through. "Drop the gun, Jacob. Walk away. Come back when you're sober, and we'll talk." Jacob's face went purple with rage. He raised the Colt again, this time with both hands, to steady his aim, and Ethan knew with absolute clarity that the next few seconds would end in death. His or Jacob's, maybe both. Then a new sound cut through the night. Hoofbeats again, but different. Multiple horses, coming fast. A voice rang out, hard with authority. "Jacob Blackwood, lower your weapon. Do it now." 3 riders materialized from the darkness. The lead horse was a bay stallion, and its rider was a man Ethan recognized. Marshal James Callahan, 52 years old, with iron-gray hair and the kind of face that had seen too much of humanity's worst and stopped being surprised by any of it. Callahan had his own rifle out, a Winchester twin to Ethan's, and it was leveled at Jacob with the steady confidence of a man who'd been in more standoffs than he cared to count. "Marshal," Jacob said, and even drunk and furious, there was a flicker of uncertainty in his voice. "This man is harboring my wife, keeping my children from me. That's against the law." "Maybe," Callahan said, swinging down from his saddle with easy grace. "Or maybe your wife ran because she feared for her life. Maybe those children are safer here than they've been in years. Maybe you need to lower that gun before I'm forced to put a bullet in you. And I'd really rather not do that on a cold night when I could be home by my fire." The 2 riders with Callahan dismounted as well. Deputy Tom Warren, young and eager, and Dr. Eleanor Hayes, the only physician for 50 miles, and a woman who'd seen enough injuries in her practice to recognize abuse when it left its marks. "Jacob," Dr. Hayes said, and her voice was gentle despite the circumstances. "I treated Ayana's hand 2 months ago. You told me she'd caught it in a door. But I've seen enough broken fingers to know the difference between an accident and a hand that was deliberately bent back until the bones snapped." Jacob's gun wavered. His face worked through a dozen different expressions. Rage and shame and grief all tangled together into something that looked almost like agony. "She's my wife," he said, and this time his voice broke. "Those are my children. I love them. I just want them home." "Then prove it," Callahan said, quietly. "Put the gun down. Let us sort this out proper, with the law and a judge. If you're right, if this is all some misunderstanding, then the court will say so. But if you pull that trigger, Jacob, if you hurt Mr. Thornfield or force your way into that cabin, then you'll hang. And your children will grow up knowing their father died on the end of a rope." The words hung in the frozen air. For a long moment, nothing moved. Then, slowly, Jacob's arm lowered. The Colt dropped from his fingers and fell into the snow with a soft thump that sounded final as a coffin lid closing. Jacob's knees buckled. He sank down, hands covering his face, and began to sob. Great, wrenching sounds that seemed to tear themselves from somewhere deep in his chest. "I don't know what happened to me," he choked out. "I used to be a good man. I used to be strong. Now I'm just this broken thing that hurts everyone I touch." Dr. Hayes moved forward, knelt beside him in the snow. "There's a hospital in Denver," she said quietly. "A place that treats men with soldiers' heart. They might be able to help you. But first, you need to accept that you need help." Callahan gestured to his deputy. "Take him into town. Get him a cell where he can sleep it off. In the morning, we'll figure out the next steps." Warren moved to comply, helping Jacob to his feet with surprising gentleness. Jacob didn't resist. The fight had gone out of him, leaving behind only exhaustion and despair. As the deputy led Jacob toward the horses, the man turned back to look at the cabin. Ethan could see his face clearly in the moonlight reflecting off the snow, and what he saw there wasn't the rage of moments before, but something sadder and more human. "Tell them," Jacob said, his voice barely carrying. "Tell Sarah and Lizzie and Mary and little Kate. Tell them their papa is sorry. Tell them I love them, even if I'm no good at showing it. Tell them they deserve better than what I became." Then he was gone, led away into the darkness, and the night fell quiet again except for the wind and the crackling of ice in the trees. Callahan approached the cabin slowly, hands visible and empty. "Mr. Thornfield, I think we need to talk." Ethan lowered the Winchester. "Come inside, Marshal. It's too cold to stand on ceremony." Inside the cabin, Ayana and the children emerged from their hiding place. The girls clung to their mother, and Thomas had finally cried himself into exhausted sleep against her shoulder. Dr. Hayes entered behind Callahan, her practiced eye immediately taking in the frightened faces, the defensive postures, the way Sarah positioned herself between her mother and any potential threat. "Mrs. Blackwood," Callahan said, and his voice was surprisingly gentle. "I need to ask you some questions. But first, I need to know if you and your children are hurt." Ayana shook her head. "Mr. Thornfield has been kind to us. We're safe here." "I'm glad to hear it. Callahan pulled out a small notebook and a pencil. Now, I need you to tell me, in your own words, what happened. Why you left your husband. Why you were out in that storm with 5 children. So Ayanna told her story again, this time for the official record. She spoke quietly, without drama, reciting facts like reading from a ledger. The first blow, the broken dishes, the escalating violence, the night Jacob broke her fingers, the decision to run. Dr. Hayes examined Ayanna's hand, photographed it with a camera she'd brought, the flash powder igniting with a bright pop that made the children jump. She checked the girls, too, finding old bruises on Sarah's shoulder, healing cuts on Lizzie's arms that she'd claimed came from thorns, but that had the straight edges of deliberate wounds. I've seen enough, Dr. Hayes said grimly. This is a clear case of domestic violence. Those children aren't safe with Jacob Blackwood. Not in his current state. Callahan nodded. Mrs. Blackwood, I'm going to recommend to Judge Blackburn that a hearing be held. We'll need to determine custody of the children and whether charges should be filed against your husband. How long? Ayanna asked. How long before he can come back? Until the judge rules otherwise, I'm placing a restriction on Jacob. He's not to come within a mile of you, these children, or Mr. Thornfield's property. If he violates that order, he'll be jailed immediately. Relief flooded Ayanna's face, so profound it was almost painful to witness. Thank you. Don't thank me yet, Callahan said. The hearing won't be easy. There are people in Stillwater who won't take kindly to a white man losing his family. There are people who'll say you belong to him by law, and that what happens between a man and his wife is private business. We'll have to fight for this. Then we fight, Ethan said. Callahan looked at him with new interest. You planning to stand with her? This could get ugly, Mr. Thornfield. People will talk. They'll make assumptions. Let them talk, Ethan said. I made a promise. I intend to keep it. The marshal studied him for a long moment, then nodded. All right, then. Hearing is set for 5 days from now. Judge Blackburn will preside. Mrs. Blackwood, you'll need to testify. And I'm afraid, Sarah, we might need you to speak as well. Sarah's small hand found her mother's. I can do it, she said, and her voice didn't shake. I can tell them what happened. After Callahan and Dr. Hayes left, riding back toward town through the moonlit snow, the cabin seemed very quiet. Ethan banked the fire, checked the locks on the door and shutters, made sure his rifle was loaded and within easy reach. Ayanna put the children to bed, singing softly in Lakota, a lullaby that spoke of safety and home and the promise of morning. One by one, they fell asleep, exhausted by fear and relief in equal measure. When she finally emerged from the sleeping area, Ayanna found Ethan sitting by the fire, staring into the flames with an expression she couldn't read. You didn't have to do that, she said quietly. You didn't have to stand between me and Jacob. You could have been killed. Yes, Ethan said, I could have. But your father stood between me and death once. Seemed only right to return the favor. She came to sit in the chair opposite his, the fire dancing between them. This isn't over. You know that. The hearing might not go our way, and even if it does, Jacob knows where we are now. He could come back. I know. So why? She leaned forward, urgency in her voice. Why risk everything for people you barely know? Ethan was quiet for a long time, watching the flames consume the wood, turning solid matter into heat and light and ash. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft. Years ago, my wife died. I buried her, And then I buried myself right alongside her. Stopped living. Stopped feeling. Just went through the motions, day after day, waiting for my turn to lie down in the cold ground. He looked at Ayanna. Then thunder led me to you and those girls, and for the first time in 4 years, I felt something other than emptiness. I felt needed. I felt like maybe I had a purpose beyond just surviving until I didn't anymore. His hand moved to the lightning path blanket, folded carefully on the table. Your father gave me back my life. Now maybe I can give you and your children back yours. Maybe that's why thunder knew the path through the storm. Maybe that's why they sat together in silence, the fire slowly dying to embers, and outside the wind whispered through the pines like a promise, or a warning, or perhaps both at once. The battle wasn't over. The hearing still loomed ahead. But tonight, they were safe. Tonight, the walls held strong against the darkness. And sometimes, that was all anyone could ask. The morning of the hearing dawned clear and cold, the kind of February day when the sun rose bright over the mountains, but brought no warmth with it. Ethan woke before first light, as he always did, and stood at the window watching the sky turn from black to deep blue to pale gold. Behind him, the cabin was still. Ayanna and the children slept the exhausted sleep of people who'd learned to take rest when they could get it, never knowing when the next crisis would steal it away. Only Wolf was awake, lying by the door with his head on his paws, brown eyes tracking Ethan's every movement. Big day ahead, Ethan murmured to the dog. Might be we're setting things right. Might be we're walking into a storm worse than the one that brought them here. Wolf's tail thumped once against the floor, a gesture of solidarity that needed no words. By the time the sun cleared the horizon, Ethan had Thunder hitched to the wagon, the big stallion's breath rising in clouds of steam. He'd packed blankets for the ride, extra wraps for the children, and the lightning path blanket folded carefully in a wooden box. Evidence, Marshal Callahan had called it. Proof of connections that ran deeper than law or logic could explain. Ayanna emerged from the cabin dressed in her best remaining clothes, a buckskin dress that had been carefully cleaned and mended, her long black hair braided with strips of red cloth that had belonged to her mother. She carried Thomas, wrapped in layers of wool, and the 4 girls followed her like ducklings, their faces scrubbed clean and their hair plaited tight. Sarah wore a serious expression that made her look older than her 9 years. Lizzie held Mary's hand with fierce protectiveness. Little Kate pressed close to her mother's side, thumb in her mouth, eyes wide with apprehension she was too young to fully understand. "Ready?" Ethan asked. Ayanna lifted her chin. "As I'll ever be." The ride to Stillwater took 2 hours through snow-packed roads. They passed other travelers, farmers heading to town for supplies, a merchant's wagon loaded with goods. Every person they passed stared. Some nodded politely. Others turned away, making their disapproval clear in the set of their shoulders and the speed with which they moved on. By the time they reached the outskirts of town, a small crowd had gathered along Main Street. Word had spread, as word always did in small places where everyone knew everyone else's business. A white rancher standing up for a native woman against her white husband. It was the kind of story that got people talking, choosing sides, drawing lines in the dirt. Mrs. Martha Hutchins stood outside her general store, arms crossed over her ample bosom, lips pressed into a thin line of disapproval. "Shameful," Ethan heard her mutter to the woman beside her. "Man ought to know better than to interfere between a husband and wife. It's not natural." But there were other faces, too. Reverend Samuel Wright stood on the church steps, and when he caught Ethan's eye, he nodded once, a gesture of quiet support. Dr. Eleanor Hayes waited near the courthouse, her medical bag in hand, ready to testify to what she'd seen and documented. And standing slightly apart from everyone else, a group of Lakota and Crow people who'd made the long journey from the reservation. Ethan recognized Thomas Morningstar, Ayanna's younger brother, a lean man of 28, with his sister's eyes and their father's strong jaw. Beside him stood several elders, their weathered faces unreadable, wrapped in blankets against the cold. The courthouse was a simple building of whitewashed wood with a bell tower that doubled as the town's fire alarm. Inside, the air was thick with tension and the smell of too many bodies packed into too small a space. Every bench was filled, and people stood along the walls, craning to see. Judge Henry Blackburn sat behind a raised desk at the front of the room, a man of 62 years with white hair, a neatly trimmed beard, and eyes that missed nothing. He'd been a judge for 20 years, presiding over everything from property disputes to murder trials, and his reputation for fairness was matched only by his reputation for impatience with foolishness. He banged his gavel once. "Court is now in session. We're here to determine custody of the minor children of Jacob and Ayanna Blackwood, and to address charges of domestic violence. Mr. Whitmore, you're representing Mr. Blackwood?" Charles Whitmore stood. He was 45, expensively dressed for a frontier town, with the smooth confidence of a man who'd won more cases than he'd lost. "I am, Your Honor. And Mrs. Blackwood, I understand you have no legal representation?" Ayanna started to stand, but before she could speak, Reverend Wright rose from his seat. "Your Honor, if I may, while I'm not a lawyer, I'd like to offer myself as a character witness and advocate for Mrs. Blackwood. I've known this family for 3 years, and I believe the court should hear the full truth of their circumstances." Judge Blackburn considered this, then nodded. "I'll allow it, but keep your statements relevant, Reverend. This isn't a pulpit." "Understood, Your Honor." Whitmore began his case with the smooth efficiency of a man who'd rehearsed every word. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter that's been complicated by misunderstanding and outside interference. Jacob Blackwood is a decorated veteran of the United States Cavalry who served his country with honor for 4 years. He fought in some of the most brutal engagements of the Indian Wars, saw comrades die, and carries the invisible wounds that many soldiers bear. He paced before the judge's bench, hands clasped behind his back. When he returned from service, he did what any good man does. He married, started a family, worked hard to provide for them. Yes, he's struggled with drink. Yes, he's made mistakes. But what man among us hasn't stumbled? What man hasn't said things in anger he later regretted? Whitmore turned to face the crowd, his voice rising with practiced indignation. Mrs. Blackwood chose to leave her husband in the middle of a deadly blizzard, taking 5 children with her. She risked their lives, endangered them deliberately, and only survived through blind luck. Is that the action of a responsible mother? Or is it the action of a woman who's been influenced by others to abandon her lawful husband? He pointed at Ethan. Mr. Ethan Thornfield has inserted himself into this family's private affairs. He's harbored Mrs. Blackwood and her children, refused to send them home, and by his own admission, threatened Mr. Blackwood with violence. Now, I ask the court to consider his motives. Could it be that Mr. Thornfield, a lonely widower, has developed an inappropriate attachment to Mrs. Blackwood? Could it be that he's encouraged her to leave her husband for his own benefit? The courtroom erupted in whispers. Ethan felt his jaw tighten, felt the heat of anger rising in his chest, but he kept his face carefully neutral. Getting angry was what Whitmore wanted. Playing into the lawyer's narrative would only make things worse. Judge Blackburn banged his gavel. "Order! Mr. Whitmore, do you have evidence for these accusations, or are you simply speculating? I'm pointing out reasonable questions, Your Honor. Questions this court should consider before tearing a family apart. Noted. Anything else? Whitmore returned to his table. Just this, Your Honor. Mr. Blackwood has informed me that he's willing to seek treatment for his drinking problem. He's willing to attend a program for veterans with soldier's heart. He's willing to do whatever it takes to be reunited with his family. All he asks is the chance to make things right. He sat down, and the silence that followed felt heavy as wet snow. Judge Blackburn turned to Ayanna. Mrs. Blackwood, would you like to respond to Mr. Whitmore's characterization of events? Ayanna stood slowly, Thomas still in her arms. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice, when she spoke, was steady. Your Honor, I didn't leave my husband because I was influenced by anyone. I left because I was afraid he was going to kill me or one of my children. She shifted Thomas to one hip, held up her right hand so the courtroom could see the crooked finger. 2 weeks ago, Jacob broke 2 of my fingers because I forgot to mend his shirt. When my daughter Sarah tried to stop him, he pushed her into a wall so hard she couldn't breathe right for an hour. Murmurs rippled through the crowd, some sympathetic, others skeptical. Before that, Ayanna continued, there were other times. Broken dishes thrown at my head. Nights when he came home so drunk he didn't recognize his own children and called them terrible names. Days when we hid in the root cellar because we could hear him shouting from 100 yards away and knew what was coming. Her voice cracked but didn't break. I ran into that storm because staying was more dangerous than freezing to death. I chose possible death over certain suffering. And if Mr. Thornfield hadn't found us, if his horse hadn't led him to where we were dying in the snow, then yes, we would have frozen. But we would have died free. She sat down, and the courtroom was absolutely silent. Judge Blackburn made a note in his ledger. Dr. Hayes, I understand you examined Mrs. Blackwood and her children? Dr. Hayes stood, carrying a folder thick with papers. I did, Your Honor. On the night of the incident with Mr. Blackwood at Mr. Thornfield's ranch, and again 2 days later in a thorough examination. She opened the folder, pulled out photographs. These images were taken using a camera with magnesium flash powder. They show Mrs. Blackwood's broken fingers, which have healed incorrectly due to lack of proper medical treatment. They show bruising on her wrists and upper arms, consistent with being grabbed forcefully. They show scarring on her back from what appears to be repeated blows with a leather strap. The photographs were passed to the judge, who examined them with an expression that grew steadily grimmer. The children, Dr. Hayes continued, show signs of chronic stress and malnutrition. Not starvation, but the kind of poor nutrition that comes from a household where money is spent on alcohol instead of adequate food. Sarah has bruising on her shoulders and upper back. Lizzie has what appear to be defensive wounds on her forearms. Mary shows signs of having been struck across the face at some point, leaving a scar near her eye. She closed the folder. In my professional opinion, these injuries are consistent with long-term domestic violence. This isn't a case of occasional discipline gone too far. This is a pattern of abuse that has been ongoing for years. Judge Blackburn set the photographs aside. Thank you, Doctor. Marshal Callahan, what did you observe on the night in question? Callahan stood. Your Honor, when I arrived at Mr. Thornfield's property, Jacob Blackwood was intoxicated and armed. He had a Colt revolver drawn and was threatening to shoot Mr. Thornfield if he didn't hand over Mrs. Blackwood and the children. He fired one shot, which went wild. Mr. Thornfield fired a warning shot. The situation was seconds away from someone dying when I intervened. The marshal pulled out his own notebook. I've also done some investigation into Mr. Blackwood's history. In the past 3 years, he's been arrested twice for drunk and disorderly conduct. Once for fighting in a saloon, once for threatening a merchant who refused to extend his credit for whiskey. Both times, the charges were dropped after he sobered up and apologized. But the pattern is there. Judge Blackburn leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Mr. Whitmore, you mentioned that Mr. Blackwood is willing to seek treatment. Where is he now? In the jail, Your Honor. Sober for 5 days now, and ready to make whatever changes necessary to be reunited with his family. Bring him in. 2 deputies escorted Jacob into the courtroom. He looked different than he had that night in the snow. Clean-shaven, hair combed, wearing clothes that had been washed and pressed. His eyes were clear, and there was a haunted quality to his face that spoke of sleepless nights and hard reckonings with himself. He didn't look at Ayanna as he took the witness chair, didn't look at the children, kept his gaze fixed on his hands, folded in his lap. Mr. Blackwood, Judge Blackburn said, you've heard the testimony. What do you have to say for yourself? Jacob's throat worked. When he spoke, his voice was hoarse. It's all true, everything they said. I did those things. I hurt my wife. I scared my children. I became the kind of man I swore I'd never be. He looked up then, and his eyes were red-rimmed. I don't remember much about that night at Thornfield's place. I was drunk, angry, out of my mind. But I remember enough to know I could have killed someone. Could have killed Ethan. Could have hurt Ayanna worse than I already have. A tear ran down his cheek. I loved her once, really loved her. And I loved those girls from the moment they were born. But somewhere along the way, I lost myself. The war did things to my head, and the whiskey made it worse, and I just kept spiraling down until I couldn't see straight anymore. He wiped his face with the back of his hand. I'm not asking for forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I'm just asking for a chance to get help, to become sober, to become the kind of man who could, maybe, someday, be allowed to see his children again. Even if Ayanna never forgives me, even if she never wants to see my face again. I just want to know my daughters don't have to be afraid anymore. The courtroom was silent as a grave. Judge Blackburn turned to Ayanna. Mrs. Blackwood, do you have anything else you'd like to say before I make my decision? Ayanna stood, and this time there was no trembling in her hands. Your Honor, I want my children to be safe. I want them to grow up knowing that home is a place of peace, not violence. I want them to learn that a man's worth isn't measured by how much he can hurt people weaker than himself, but by how he protects them. She glanced at Ethan, and something passed between them, some understanding that needed no words. Mr. Thornfield showed my daughters what a good man looks like. He showed them that strength can be gentle, that power can be used to protect instead of destroy. I want that for them. I want that future. She sat down, and Judge Blackburn nodded slowly. I'm going to ask Sarah Blackwood to approach the bench, he said quietly. Sarah stood. At 9 years old, she looked impossibly small walking to the front of the courtroom, but her spine was straight, and her head held high. The judge's voice gentled. Sarah, I know this is difficult, but I need to ask you some questions, and I need you to tell me the truth. Can you do that? Yes, sir. Do you love your father? Sarah's lip trembled. Yes, sir, I do. Even after everything that's happened. He's still my papa. He used to be good. He used to read to me and teach me things. I remember that man. But I don't see him anymore when I look at him now. Judge Blackburn leaned forward. "Sarah, if I were to send you and your sisters back to live with your father, how would you feel?" The girl's face crumpled. Tears spilled down her cheeks, and her voice came out as barely a whisper. "Please don't. Please, sir. I know he's my papa, and I know I'm supposed to honor him, but I'm so scared. I'm scared he'll hurt Mama. I'm scared he'll hurt my sisters. I'm scared that one day we'll wake up and he'll have gone too far and someone will be dead." She sobbed once, a sound that tore through the courtroom like a blade. "I don't want to be afraid anymore. I just want to feel safe." Judge Blackburn's face was stone, but his eyes were wet. "Thank you, Sarah. You can sit down now." The girl fled back to her mother, buried her face against Ayanna's side, and wept. The judge was silent for a long time, shuffling papers that didn't need shuffling, composing himself. When he finally spoke, his voice was firm and clear. "I've heard enough. Here is my ruling." The courtroom held its collective breath. Full custody of Sarah, Elizabeth, Mary, Catherine, and Thomas Blackwood is hereby granted to their mother, Ayanna Blackwood. Jacob Blackwood is ordered to stay no less than 1 mile away from Mrs. Blackwood and her children at all times. Any violation of this order will result in immediate arrest and imprisonment. Relief flooded Ayanna's face like sunrise. "Furthermore," the judge continued, "Mr. Blackwood is ordered to seek treatment for alcoholism and for what the military calls soldier's heart. There's a hospital in Denver that specializes in treating veterans. You'll go there, Mr. Blackwood, and you'll stay there until the doctors say you're well enough to leave. That's not a suggestion. That's a court order." Jacob nodded, unable to speak. "After 2 years, if you can prove you've maintained sobriety and completed your treatment, you may petition this court for supervised visitation with your children. But only if they want to see you. Their wishes will be paramount." Judge Blackburn banged his gavel. "This court is adjourned." The sound of that gavel falling was like a door closing on one life and opening on another. People began filing out, some looking satisfied, others disappointed that the drama had ended without more spectacle. Ethan guided Ayanna and the children through the crowd, keeping himself between them and anyone who might have unkind words to share. Outside, the winter sun was bright and cold. Thomas Morningstar approached, followed by the elders from the reservation. "Sister," he said, and wrapped Ayanna in an embrace that spoke of years of worry finally eased. One of the elders, a woman with white braids and a face like ancient wood, touched Ayanna's cheek. "Your mother would be proud. You stood strong." Ayanna wept then, great heaving sobs of relief and grief and exhaustion all mixed together. Her brother held her while she cried, and the children pressed close, and Ethan stood slightly apart, giving them space for this moment that belonged to family. But Sarah broke away from the group and came to stand beside him. She slipped her small hand into his calloused one and looked up with eyes that had seen too much, but still held hope. "Thank you," she said simply. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. "You were very brave in there. I learned from watching you." Before Ethan could respond, Thomas Morningstar approached. "Mr. Thornfield, my sister tells me you carry my father's blanket, that he died saving your life." "He did," Ethan said quietly. Thomas studied him for a long moment. "The elders would like to meet you, properly. There are things that need to be said, ceremonies that should be performed. Will you come to the reservation?" Ethan glanced at Ayanna, who nodded through her tears. "I'll come," he said. "It's past time." As they loaded into the wagon for the long ride back to the ranch, Ethan felt something shift in his chest. Something that had been locked tight for 4 years was finally beginning to open. Not all the way, not yet, but enough to let in a sliver of light. Enough to remind him that being alive and living were not the same thing, and that sometimes the hardest storms led to the clearest skies. 3 days after the hearing, Ethan hitched Thunder to the wagon in the cold light of dawn and prepared for the journey south to the Crow Reservation. The sky was pale as milk, promising snow later, but the roads were still passable if they moved quickly. Ayanna emerged from the cabin, wearing the buckskin dress her mother had made, adorned now with beadwork that had belonged to 3 generations of Morning Star women. She'd braided her hair with strips of red and yellow cloth, the colors of sunrise, and carried Thomas wrapped in the lightning path blanket that had started this whole journey. The 4 girls were dressed in their best as well, each wearing a small beaded necklace that Thomas had brought from the reservation, gifts from grandmothers and aunts who were eager to welcome them home. Wolf jumped into the wagon bed without prompting, taking his customary position as guardian. Thunder stamped once, breath rising in clouds, ready for the work ahead. The journey took 4 hours through country that grew progressively wilder as they moved south. The flat prairie gave way to rolling hills dotted with pine and juniper. Frozen creeks cut through valleys like silver scars. In the distance, the Beartooth Mountains rose against the sky, their peaks white with eternal snow. Sarah sat beside Ethan on the bench, quiet but watchful. She'd been different since the hearing, carrying herself with a new confidence, as if speaking her truth in that courtroom had lifted some weight she'd been bearing alone. "Mr. Thornfield," she said, after they'd traveled an hour in comfortable silence, "can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Do you think my papa will get better? Really better, I mean. Not just stop drinking for a while and then start again." Ethan considered the question carefully, knowing that the answer mattered more than comfort or false hope. "I don't know, Sarah. I've known men who fought their demons and won. And I've known men who never stopped fighting because they never really wanted to win. Your father has to want to change more than he wants to stay the same. Nobody can want it for him." "But what if he does get better? What if 2 years from now he's sober and the doctors say he's well? Will Mama have to let him back?" The judge said, "You children get to choose. If you don't want to see him, nobody can force you. But Sarah, I'll tell you something I've learned in 42 years on this earth. Forgiveness isn't about saying what someone did was all right. It's about deciding you're not going to let what they did keep poisoning you." He glanced down at her serious young face. "You don't have to forgive your father today or tomorrow or ever. But if the day comes when you want to, when you're ready to, that'll be your choice too. And whatever you choose, it'll be the right choice for you." Sarah nodded slowly, processing this. Then she leaned against his shoulder, a gesture of trust that made Ethan's throat tight. Behind them, in the wagon bed, Lizzie was teaching Mary a hand-clapping game their grandmother had taught them years ago. The rhythm and song passed down through generations. Little Kate sat in her mother's lap, playing with the fringe on Ayanna's dress, content in a way she'd never been at their father's house. When they crested the final hill and the reservation spread out below them, Ayanna drew in a sharp breath. It had been nearly 6 years since she'd seen this place. 6 years since Jacob had effectively cut her off from her family, claiming they were a bad influence, that they filled her head with ideas above her station. The reservation consisted of 47 houses arranged in loose clusters, most of them simple log structures with smoking chimneys, a few traditional teepees set up for ceremonies or for elders who preferred the old ways. In the center stood the community lodge, a large building that served as gathering place, courthouse, and spiritual center. People emerged as thunder pulled the wagon into the clearing. Women in wool dresses and blanket coats, men in a mix of traditional and white man's clothing, children who stopped their play to stare at the newcomers. And, at the forefront, a council of elders, 7 men and women whose combined ages stretched back over 500 years of living. Thomas Morningstar helped his sister down from the wagon, embraced each of his nieces with fierce affection, and held baby Thomas up to the sky in a gesture of presentation, naming him in Lakota for all to hear. An elder woman stepped forward, the same one who'd spoken to Ayanna outside the courthouse. Her name was Rain Woman, and she'd been the tribe's spiritual leader for 30 years, carrying wisdom that went deeper than book learning or legal precedent. Ayanna, daughter of William and Singing Dove, you have returned to us. We welcome you and your children back to the land of your ancestors. She turned to Ethan, dark eyes examining him with an intensity that felt like being read in a language he didn't speak. Ethan Thornfield, you carry the blanket of William Morningstar. You carry the debt of a life saved and a life lost. The council would speak with you. It wasn't a request. Ethan nodded. I'm honored. The community lodge was dim inside, lit by a fire in the central pit and by shafts of sunlight that came through smoke holes in the roof. The 7 elders sat in a semicircle, and Ethan was directed to sit facing them, cross-legged on a woven mat, with the lightning path blanket folded carefully in his lap. Rain Woman spoke first. Tell us of William Morningstar's death. Leave nothing out. We have waited 10 years for the truth. So Ethan told the story again, every detail he could remember. The ice on Beartooth Pass, the wagon rolling, his leg trapped, the cold seeping into his bones, William appearing like a spirit sent by the Creator, the strength it took to lift that axle, the blanket wrapped around a dying stranger, the ground giving way, the fall into darkness. When he finished, silence filled the lodge. One of the male elders, a man called White Cloud, spoke in Lakota. Rain Woman translated. White Cloud says you have carried this burden alone for 10 years. He asks why you did not come to us sooner. Fear, Ethan said simply, and shame. I was afraid to face the family of the man who died saving me. Afraid they would hate me for living when he didn't. I know now that was cowardice. I should have come. I should have given you the truth, while Singing Dove still lived to hear it. White Cloud spoke again, longer this time, his voice rising and falling in the rhythmic cadence of formal speech. Rain Woman's translation came measured and careful. White Cloud says fear is human, but honor demands courage. You failed in your duty to William Morningstar's family by staying silent, but you have honored his memory by protecting his daughter and grandchildren when they had no other shelter. The debt is not fully paid, but neither is it ignored. Another elder, a woman called Morningstar, spoke in English, her voice creaky with age. My brother William was a good man, strong in body, strong in spirit. He believed that to see suffering and turn away was the greatest sin a person could commit. He saw you dying, and he acted, knowing the risk. That was who he was. That is how he should be remembered. She reached out a gnarled hand. Give me the blanket. Ethan placed it gently in her hands. She unfolded it, running her fingers over the lightning path pattern, over the stitches that her sister-in-law and niece had sewn with such care. This blanket kept you alive. It fulfilled its purpose. William would be glad. She looked at Ayanna, who sat at the edge of the circle with her children. But it belongs to his daughter now, to his grandchildren. It should stay in the family. Ayanna shook her head. Mr. Thornfield earned it with 10 years of guilt and a night of facing down my husband's gun. He's earned the right to keep it or give it back, whichever he chooses. Ethan looked at the blanket, thinking of all it represented. The debt, the guilt, the connection to a man he'd known for less than an hour, but who'd changed the course of his entire life. "I'd like to give it back," he said quietly, "but not to keep in a chest or hang on a wall. I'd like it to be used. I'd like it to keep people warm, the way it kept me warm. That's what William would have wanted, I think. For it to serve a purpose." Rain Woman smiled, the expression transforming her weathered face. "You understand more than many who were born to our ways. Very well. The blanket returns to the Morning Star family, to be used as they see fit." White Cloud spoke again, and this time Rain Woman's translation carried a different weight. "The council has discussed what should be done. You saved William's daughter and grandchildren. You stood before the white man's law and defended them. You have shown courage and honor. Therefore, we offer you adoption into the tribe. You would be brother to Ayanna, uncle to her children, part of this community. You would have responsibilities and rights, duties and privileges. Do you accept?" The question landed like a stone thrown into still water, ripples spreading outward into implications Ethan hadn't considered. "I'm honored," he said slowly. "More than I can express. But I need to understand what this means. I'm a white man who owns a ranch 15 miles from here. I can't abandon that life, that land. My father built that place with his own hands. It's his legacy." "We do not ask you to abandon anything," Rain Woman said, "only to accept that you now have 2 families, one of blood and memory, one of choice and action. You can be both Thornfield and Morning Star. You can live in both worlds." Ethan looked at Ayanna. She met his gaze steadily, and he saw something there he hadn't let himself name before. Trust, yes. Gratitude, certainly. But also something warmer, something that made his heart beat faster and reminded him he was still a man capable of feeling things he'd thought died with Margaret. "I accept," he said. The ceremony that followed was unlike anything Ethan had experienced. The elders sang in Lakota, their voices rising in harmonies that seemed older than the mountains themselves. They painted symbols on his face with ochre and clay, markings that Rain Woman explained represented protection, courage, and the joining of paths. They gave him a new name, speaking it first in Lakota, then translating. "He who walks between storms." Because, Rain Woman explained, he had come to Ayanna and her children in the middle of a blizzard, and guided them through the storm of violence to the calm beyond. Finally, they brought out a star quilt, the traditional gift for momentous occasions. It was 8 feet by 6 feet, made of cotton fabric in deep blues and reds and yellows, with a large star pattern radiating from the center. The work of many hands, many hours, many prayers, stitched into every seam. Rain Woman and Morning Star lifted the quilt and placed it over Ethan's shoulders, then beckoned Ayanna forward. They draped the other half over her shoulders, so the 2 of them stood connected by the blanket, its weight shared between them. "This is not a marriage," Rain Woman said clearly, her words meant for everyone present. "That choice is for Ayanna and Ethan to make in their own time, if they choose to make it at all. This is a recognition of bond, of family created not by blood, but by the fires of hardship and the choice to stand together. May the Creator bless this joining of paths. The community responded in Lakota, a word Ethan didn't understand, but that felt like affirmation, like welcome, like the opening of a door that had been closed. Afterward, there was food: venison stew and fry bread, wild rice cooked with berries, coffee strong enough to strip paint. The children ran and played with cousins they'd never met, and their laughter rose like smoke into the cold afternoon air. Thomas Morningstar pulled Ethan aside as the sun began its descent toward the western mountains. "My sister hasn't smiled like that in 6 years," he said quietly. "Not since she married Jacob. I want to thank you for giving her back something I thought was gone forever." "I didn't do anything but open my door," Ethan said. "You did more than that. You stood when you could have stepped aside. You risked when you could have stayed safe. That matters. That means something." Thomas hesitated, then continued. "Jacob isn't a bad man, not at his core. The war broke something in him that whiskey couldn't fix. I don't hate him. I pity him. But I also won't let him near my sister or those children until I'm sure the breaking is healed." "That's wise. Ayanna cares for you. You know that, don't you?" Ethan felt heat rise in his face. "We've only known each other 2 weeks. My father knew my mother for 3 days before he knew he was going to marry her. Sometimes the heart sees faster than the head can follow." Thomas clapped him on the shoulder. "Just don't take 10 years to do something about it like you did with that blanket." As evening fell, and it became clear they'd need to stay the night rather than risk the roads in darkness, Ethan found himself standing outside the community lodge, looking up at stars that blazed in the clear winter sky. Ayanna found him there, the star quilt wrapped around her shoulders against the cold. "Your father used to tell me stories about the stars," she said softly, coming to stand beside him. "Lakota stories, where the stars are the spirits of ancestors watching over us. He said my grandmother was up there, the bright one near the North Star, keeping guard." "It's a good thought," Ethan said. "Do you think they're watching? My father, your wife? Do you think they see what's happening here?" Ethan was quiet for a long moment. "I'd like to think so. Margaret told me not to bury myself beside her. Told me to find life again. And your father died because he believed one life was worth saving. Maybe they're both pleased we figured out how to live instead of just survive." Ayanna turned to face him. In the starlight, her face was luminous, beautiful in a way that made his breath catch. "I'm not ready for anything more than what we have right now," she said. "I need time to heal, to learn who I am when I'm not afraid. The girls need stability, not confusion about what you are to us. I understand. But I want you to know that when I am ready, whenever that might be, I hope you'll still be there. I hope you'll still be patient. Because I think maybe the Creator had a plan when thunder led you to us in that storm." Ethan reached out slowly, giving her time to step away if she wanted to, and took her hand. Her fingers were cold, and he wrapped his larger hand around them, sharing warmth. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. "However long it takes, I'll be there. That's a promise." They stood together under the watching stars, 2 people who'd been broken by loss and violence, who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances, who were learning slowly, carefully, how to build something new from the wreckage of what had been. Inside the lodge, the children were settling down for sleep, surrounded by family, safe in a way they'd never been before. Sarah's voice rose in a song Ayanna had taught her, a lullaby about stars and spirits and the promise of morning. Wolf lay across the threshold, keeping watch. Thunder stood in the corral, head high, ears forward, as if he too was listening to the songs and finding them good. And in a hospital in Denver, 200 miles away, Jacob Blackwood woke from a dreamless sleep, went to his first meeting with the doctors who would try to heal what war had broken, and took the first difficult step on a road that might, if he was strong enough and lucky enough, lead to redemption. The night deepened. The temperature dropped. But inside the lodge and in the hearts of those gathered there, warmth held against the cold. This was not an ending. It was barely even a beginning. The road ahead would have rough patches, moments of doubt, old wounds that would ache when the weather changed. But tonight, wrapped in starlight and star quilts, surrounded by family both old and new, it was enough to simply be, to breathe freely, to know that home was no longer a place, but a collection of people who'd chosen to stand together against whatever storms might come. Tomorrow, they would return to Ethan's ranch. Tomorrow, the work of building a life would continue. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges and choices. But tonight, beneath the stars that held the spirits of ancestors and the promises of the future, there was only peace. And sometimes, peace was the greatest gift of all. Epilogue. 20 years later, in the winter of 1907, an old man sat by a fire in a ranch house built of pine logs, his gnarled hands wrapped around a cup of coffee gone cold, while outside, the Montana wind sang its eternal song. Ethan Thornfield was 62 years old now, his hair white as the snow that covered his land, his face lined by decades of sun and wind and hard work. But his eyes were still clear, still sharp, and they held a contentment that came from a life well lived. On the wall behind him hung a photograph in a simple wooden frame. The image, taken in the summer of 1888, showed a family, a rancher and his wife, 5 children arranged around them, and in the corner, barely visible, the massive head of a horse, whose eyes seemed to hold ancient wisdom. Ayanna Morningstar Thornfield sat in the chair across from him, 52 years old and beautiful still, her hair streaked with gray, but her spirit undimmed. They'd married in 1888, in a ceremony that honored both white and Lakota traditions, and had lived the 20 years since in a partnership built on respect, understanding, and a love that had grown slowly, like ancient trees, until its roots were too deep to ever be torn out. The children had grown and thrived. Sarah was 29 now, married to a rancher from the next county over, with 2 children of her own. Lizzie taught school on the reservation, sharing knowledge with the next generation. Mary had become a nurse, working with Dr. Hayes. Kate helped run the ranch, her skill with horses nearly equal to her adoptive father's. And Thomas, 20 years old, was studying law in Denver, preparing to fight for his people's rights with words and legal briefs instead of rifles. Thunder had died in 1912 at the age of 33, ancient for a horse. They buried him on the hill overlooking the ranch, and sometimes, when the wind was right, Ethan swore he could still hear the big stallion's whinny, calling across the years. Wolf had followed him a year later, dying peacefully in his sleep in 1913 at the age of 30, which the veterinarian had said was practically a miracle for a dog of his size. And Jacob Blackwood had completed his treatment, maintained his sobriety, and in 1889 had been granted supervised visits with his daughters. The meetings had been awkward at first, painful for everyone involved. But slowly, carefully, with the help of doctors and prayer and sheer stubborn determination, Jacob had rebuilt some portion of what he'd destroyed. He would never be a father in the way he'd once been. Too much had happened. Too many wounds had been inflicted. But he'd become a presence in his daughters' lives again, someone they could respect, if not fully trust, someone they could acknowledge without fear. He died in 1920, sober to the last, and Sarah had wept at his funeral. Not for who he'd been in his worst moments, but for who he might have been if the war hadn't taken so much from him. But tonight, in this moment, those stories were past and memory. Tonight was for the present, for the warmth of fire and companionship, and a life built from the ruins of what had been lost. Ayanna set down her mending and looked at her husband. "You're thinking about that night again. The storm. How did you know?" "Because you always get that look when you're remembering, like you're seeing something the rest of us can't quite make out." Ethan smiled. "I was thinking about thunder, about how he knew the path when I couldn't see it, about how one choice, one moment of trust, changed everything that came after. Your father was right. Trust your horse before you trust yourself." He was right about a lot of things. Ethan looked into the fire, watching the flames dance the way he'd watched them dance 10,000 times before. People say destiny is just coincidence, but I know different. I know destiny has hooves and knows the path through a blizzard when a man's eyes see nothing but white death. Ayanna came to sit on the arm of his chair, and he wrapped an arm around her waist, holding her close. "We had a good life," she said softly. "We did. Are you ready? When it's time?" Ethan thought about this, about the inevitable ending that came for every story, every life, every love. "I think so. I think when my time comes, I'll go knowing I did right by your father's sacrifice, knowing I gave you and those children a home, knowing I loved well and was loved in return. A man couldn't ask for more than that." Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the shutters, singing through the pines, carrying with it the scent of snow and the promise of storms yet to come. But inside, the fire burned warm, the walls held strong, and two people who'd found each other in the worst of circumstances sat together in the peace of knowing they'd built something that would outlast them both. The children would carry it forward. The grandchildren would inherit not just land and possessions, but the story of how love could grow in the aftermath of violence, how courage could exist alongside fear, how sometimes the worst storms brought the greatest gifts. Ethan closed his eyes, let the warmth of the fire and his wife's presence wash over him, and remembered a horse that refused to go home, remembered a woman and her children dying in the snow, remembered a blanket marked with lightning paths, remembered standing in a doorway between a terrified family and a broken man with a gun, remembered choosing in that moment to be more than what he'd been, to be what William Morningstar had been when he saw a stranger dying in the cold, to be someone who didn't turn away from suffering, to be someone who understood that sometimes destiny doesn't come as a gentle nudge, but as a blizzard that tears through your life and leaves you standing in wreckage that might be ending, or might, if you're brave enough to believe it, be the beginning of everything. The fire crackled, the wind sang, and in the peaceful silence of a life well lived, Ethan Thornfield smiled and held his wife close and was grateful.